Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Berry. I'm with the Baltimore, Maryland 250 Labor History Project, and this is one of our podcasts about working in Baltimore and labor and unions and work. And my guest today, and this is mid-January, is Thurman Wenzl, who now lives in Kentucky, in Cincinnati, but worked here in Baltimore on the docks starting in the 1970s. So, Thurman, welcome, and tell us how you started working on the docks.
Well, I moved to Baltimore in May 1974, uh, expecting to find an industrial job of some sort. And in June 74, as a result of a racial discrimination lawsuit, new jobs opened up on the docks via the International Longshoremen's Association. And in June 74, I paid an initiation fee to the ILA Local 333 and started work unloading bananas.
What was that like?
Well, in general, longshoring work was very different from day to day. Uh, in those days, unloading bananas meant um, grabbing individual 40-pound boxes of bananas. A gang of perhaps 27 men in the hold would be grabbing the boxes and throwing them on a conveyor. And another gang at the other end of the conveyor on the docks would be grabbing the boxes off of the conveyor and loading them into a trailer truck to be headed all over the East Coast. One trailer truck would hold about 900 boxes of bananas.
And how big were the crews?
Well, it changed from day to day. There were many manufactured goods that we loaded with a 17-person crew. A gang in this context means 17 guys who work together regularly. It has nothing to do with violence. Um, The banana boats required larger gangs, approximately 27 men in the hold of the ship and maybe another 25 on the dock loading the trucks.
And so, did you come from the hall to get these jobs?
Yes, there's no such thing as a regular 40-hour week on the docks. Low seniority people had to get in line with other people in their same seniority category and wait for work. I was the so-called H man, A, B, C, D. A were the highest seniority. And every Wednesday, a banana boat came in from, every Monday and Wednesday, a banana boat came in from Central America. And those were the days when the low seniority people like myself could get work.
So you were basically a supplemental hire for,
Yeah, or a short seniority person
okay.
initially. Um, Shortly thereafter, gang membership became available as a result of the new men joining the local in
Okay.
June. And I became a member of Rudy's gang, which meant some days I'd work via Rudy's gang, other days I'd work at the hiring center by seeking work for the next day.
And what does it mean, Woody's gang?
It was Rudy,
Rudy, I'm sorry.
so-called gang carrier. Uh,
What's a
gang,
gang? What is a gang carrier? You understand you're talking to people who don't know, including myself, all the vocabulary. So
yes. Longshoring and the ILA is very much a craft union. A gang carrier was a union member uh, who supervised the 17 men in his gang and kept attendance, etc. The stevedoring firm for which we worked uh, gave us very general direction. We're unloading bananas today, we're unloading steel today, but the details of the work were controlled by the gang carrier and the men. Um, and Rouge gang did not have work every day. Some high seniority gangs with favoritism got 4 or 5 days of work a week. Rudy's gang only got 1 or 2 days of work per week. There
so
were about
what
a
did
total of 60 gangs.
where were you living while you were working on the docks?
I was over in the Patterson Park neighborhood,
Okay.
which was relatively convenient to the docks in Canton and Dundalk Marine Terminal.
And so what was a typical work or a typical day like? Would you go to the hall and hope to get hired, or would you
Uh, well, there weren't really typical days, but let me
okay.
try to summarize because it's very different from day to day. Um, if Rudy's gang, quote unquote, had orders, each afternoon when I wasn't working, I would bike to Fells Point to check the bulletin board to see if my gang had work. If not, I would count the number of gangs the next day, because whether I would get work the next day would depend on how many ships were arriving.
Yeah.
So counting gangs at Fells Point in 4 in the afternoon was an important thing. Was it worth it to go to the hiring center the next morning? If there were 20 gangs working on a given Thursday, forget it. The high seniority guys would get all the jobs. If there were 45 gangs, I would get up early, get in line at the hiring center at 20 after 6 and hope to have work by 7:30.
And so you could actually just work
That was a crapshoot.
a couple days a week when you were starting. You were able to financially
Yes,
survive.
even with 8 years seniority, I only averaged 24 hours a week of work
Okay.
per week. So yeah,
But
so
were
it
you
was very
paid
much
enough that those 24 hours you could live, or did you have other jobs?
yes. One of the advantages of the union contract, moderately good hourly wages, and everything that wasn't between 8 and 5 in a weekday was overtime.
Okay.
So if a job started at 7 p.m., for example, that was all overtime. So yes, I could live in a affordable row house north of Patterson Park
Okay.
on 24 hours of work a week.
Okay. Well, so uh, you got involved in the politics of the local? Were there other people working like you did who came in from the outside?
Yes, 3 or 4 of us were very interested in making the local union a little more democratic and getting the members involved. Um, we published a little newsletter called The Talking Delegate. The name Talking Delegate comes from longshore lingo for a business agent. A business agent in the Teamsters is a walking delegate in the ILA. So the
Okay.
walking delegate is the full-time union. We Our newsletter we called The Talking Delegate.
And so was your group
And the
politically
three of
involved before you came to the local?
uh, not directly, indirectly, some of us were involved in international solidarity work around Chile, for example. But no,
Okay.
it was just an ad hoc little group of progressive longshoremen who wanted to democratize and get people involved.
Well, what was that group like?
Well, it was small and not particularly successful in getting a lot of the members involved. There were perhaps 300, perhaps 3,000 union members. Um, 50, oh, a little bit of history. 1974 was the beginning of the merger of 2 segregated ILA locals. So of 3,000 longshoremen, about 1,500 were white, 1,500 were black. And a quorum for a union meeting was 60 workers.
Hmm.
About half the time, we were able to get 60 workers to show up at a union meeting to speak up about safety, seniority, working conditions.
Okay. Was there still a hangover from the segregation of the previous years? Because
Very
in,
much so.
oh,
Um,
how
there,
so?
there were still black gangs and white gangs, for
Okay.
example, from that history. Um, Rudy's was a quote unquote black gang, which I joined as part of the fairness structure. Prior to 74, joining a gang was very much a personal thing. If you've got a father or an uncle in the industry, you can get in, et cetera, et cetera. But that 74 agreement with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission insisted on some better organization.
Well, that was a crucial
Um,
year because,
but racism,
no, go ahead.
racism was definitely still an issue. Um, some of the most, well, there were some black gangs were considered favorites of the employers um, and got 4 days of work a week. But many of the black gangs, such as the one I was in, Rudy's gang, barely got 1 or 2 days of work per week. And sometimes the more difficult jobs, the work varied very much from manual handling of charcoal sacks, for example, to modern container ships where the work was relatively clean.
Well, you were at a
So it was
transition in
very
terms of how the technology of the longshore was done, correct? From physical labor
very
to
much so.
containerized.
And it was very much a gradual process. The modern debate about containerization, in some sense, obscures the fact it was a very gradual process from, quote unquote, putting our hands on the freight. That was our phrase for the manual jobs. Through the use of a forklift, and a whole pallet full of bricks, for example, would be picked up and a forklift lifted into the hole to stack the pallet full of bricks. And then gradually, from different parts of the world, like the Northern European trade containerized long before the trade with Latin America. Latin America freight would very often be manual freight, picking up each box, whereas the beer coming from Hamburg, Germany, for example, was already in containers when I started work.
Well, I was starting to say, for the people who are watching this, 1974 was a crucial year in terms of the civil rights movement, because it was the year that the consent decree was signed at Sparrows Point, which eliminated racial discrimination down there. As you were talking about, the attitude still prevailed, but the structure had gone. It was also a period where public sector unions in Baltimore were organizing as a result, as part of a civil rights movement. And we're going to have Jane Berger on, who's written a book on that topic, and very good issues. So it's a crucial time. And you were just happened to be here in Baltimore at the right time. When you were in your community, were there other activities going on, civil rights and agitation stuff?
Oh, well, definitely so. And besides the sectors of the labor movement that you just mentioned, there were active folks trying to democratize the National Steelworkers Union and the Machinists Union. And there was a small scale effort by the hospital workers. I think it was unsuccessful at Johns Hopkins at that time. So there were a lot of other industries where folks were getting involved. And of course, on the national level, 74 was when Nixon was forced to resign.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of things were happening in 74.
Okay. And it's as if it's exactly like what's happening today. There's just a lot of things as we talk about these histories. Outside, it's a very, very different time. Well, let's go back to the descriptions about your campaigns in the union. What did you try to do? And I'm going to see here if I can find. Okay, go ahead. Talk about that, and I'm going to bring up.
Okay. Yes, basically, the ILA is a very conservative craft union. Does not publish a newspaper. It does not do a very good job of informing the members about what's going on. Our local union was relatively democratic compared to the quote unquote international headquartered in New York. The international headquartered in New York had a staff in
there. Can you see
Baltimore
your
that we paid no
leaflet?
attention to. I can see it on the screen, yes.
Good. Okay. Well, then other people can see it too. Good. We'll talk about that. We just want to show you what this looks like. It's a little small. Can you just tell us what the leaflet said?
Yes. If I can summarize, again, this is 1977. I had been on the docks about 2.5 years. We had local union elections every 2 years, and this was an effort to join the executive board. There were probably 5 other officers and maybe 4 members of the executive board up for election. And the things I highlighted were contract, democracy, and unity. A decent contract that would have been handled at the coast-wide level, meaning the local union would play a relatively small role in the national contract negotiations. Democracy was even a bigger problem at the national level because the leadership of the ILA is not elected by the members. It's elected by a convention. So that was a serious problem as far as getting member feedback. And unity is a reference to the history of racism on the docks and the fact that everybody needed to cooperate to make some real changes and make the local union more responsive on safety issues, on job security, et cetera.
And how did your co-workers respond to your campaign? Did you, for example, take leaflets into the job in the hold of a ship when you were there?
Yes. One thing, again, on background, um, I was perhaps the only candidate who had a written leaflet about what I stood for. Again, the conservative background to this environment is that um, campaigns were all verbal, meaning people talked to their friends. There was no other candidate wrote down anything about why people should vote for him. Um, Yes, on a small scale, I distributed it, and people knew who I was from the hiring center. Uh, People in the favorite gangs wouldn't have a circle of coworkers. In my case, because I was at the hiring center 3 or 4 days a week, and was a so-called H-man, a low seniority person, a lot of people knew who I was. So it was important that I get a leaflet with my picture out there with a brief summary of um, what kind of changes I needed to see. By the way, I did not win. I got maybe 125 votes and needed 700 maybe to win. But this was part of a campaign, again, with a newsletter that we called the Talking Delegate. Safety got to be an issue. Um, we had no
Was
formal training. It was quite a dangerous job.
uh,
Can I
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead with safety?
Go ahead. Talk about that.
Yeah. Because of the uh, changing work environment from one day to the next, different shifts from different parts of the world, different surfaces on which to work, um, you get in serious trouble around safety. There was no formal safety training. Experienced guys had to help out rookies on where to stand, how to grab the freight safely. And that was already an issue early on in my 8-year career there. It must have been about 1975. I suggested at a union meeting that we create a local union safety committee to talk about better training for rookies, et cetera. The president of the local struck me down by explaining that if Baltimore got to be a safety conscious port, the shippers would sail their ships to Philadelphia instead. So that was an ongoing problem, was the threat of one, because again, the workplace are mobile, the ships, they could go to Norfolk and Philadelphia just as easily as Baltimore. And the local unions across those ports did not really cooperate. That
Yeah.
would have been the job at the International, but they didn't encourage such cooperation. So I could talk at some length about safety, but
Well, go
generally
ahead.
the local union leadership
Oh, go ahead. That's an important
wasn't very,
topic.
um, there were a lot of injuries and a lot of fatalities during my 8 years there. Um, and part of what our little group wanted to do was to get the members involved in pressuring the employers to slow down the jobs, less favoritism. Because again, favoritism among gangs meant that if Rudy's gang got a reputation for being safety conscious, well, they wouldn't get a job the rest of that week. And there was nothing the local union would be willing to do about that.
Mhm. Well, you talk about
So there were
fatalities.
maybe 12.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, I came close to losing a finger myself in a lot of smaller scale accidents, but one young rookie uh, died of a crushed chest, but he was standing in the wrong place when a swinging steel plate pinned him between the plate and a
Mm,
stanchion on the ship. A
mm,
stanchion is the pole that supports the ship. Um, there were maybe 12 fatalities during my 8 years on the docks,
mm.
usually crushing, caught between machinery, falls. And it was very important that people pay attention to what was going on because, again, it changed from minute to very different than the assembly line. It's kind of predictable. Everything was different from 1 hour to the next, one day to the next.
Mm. And the local didn't do any training or any help for adjustment of this stuff.
That's right. That's improved a little bit since then with some formal training for forklift drivers, for example. In my day, there was no training for forklift drivers. The way I learned to drive a forklift was at lunch hour. You hopped on a vacant forklift and you practiced
Mm,
uh, checking out how the blade to go under a pallet. And that's how people learned.
You keep talking about a hiring center. Describe what that was.
Okay. Well, the first hiring center, jointly controlled between the union and the stevedoring firms. It was on Clinton Street, down in Canton. Um, and it was a big hall with an office in one end and a row of uh, a place where people divided up by seniority to seek work at 7:30 in the morning. So it was a big hall with an office where jobs were dispatched. After you got a job from one of these lines, you went over and got a blue slip that said you had a job, and you carried that slip to the pier where the work was, and you handed it to the gang carrier. But again, there were like eight lines, A men down to H men, lines of longshoremen, and every job was offered to the high seniority guys first. That was one big problem as far as job distribution. It wasn't unusual for very high seniority guys to work 55 and 60 hours per week,
Mm,
while the low seniority guys, even with seniority myself, struggling to get 20 hours per week.
okay.
And that was one of the issues, by the way, that caused the split between the San Francisco longshoremen and the East Coast longshoremen in the 30s, still unresolved in Baltimore in the 70s.
What was that
The
split?
fair distribution.
Of distribution of
The
work.
split was around control over the hiring center and distribution of the work
Okay.
across the various longshoremen as
Yeah.
opposed to strict seniority.
Well, I think for people who have seen it, uh, the movie On the Waterfront shows what happens when you don't have a hiring hall. And at the end of the movie, all the people come up begging for jobs uh, at the ship. And we've seen many of unions, certainly all the building trades here. My experience, I was in the carpenters union. We had a hiring hall so that the union controlled who worked. And sometimes that was unfair, but it was certainly better than having the employers control only who works and who gets work on a particular day. And the
The
hiring
term
halls over a 30 years battle between the unions and the companies to get established. Uh, we have a very good guy of retired president from the Masters Mates and Pilots, Don Marcus, and their whole history for the captains of the ships was over hiring halls. So it's a
Mhm.
whole issue, and it's a vocabulary that many people don't understand. And that's why I want to go into it here in some detail as part of labor
Mhm.
history. Uh,
One thing, if I could elaborate on your reference to on the waterfront, um, our terminology for that crowd of people is called a shape up,
yeah.
at least in Baltimore, the term. And we use the term in Baltimore to hustle for work. The hiring center during my days only applied to daytime work. Um, and it was not unusual. Because I was seeking more hours, I would so-called hustle at the piers when the ship arrived. So on a Saturday evening at 6:30, I'd head down to the Copper Dock on Clinton
Hmm.
Street um, to seek work. And if the gang carrier recognized a person as theoretically a person off the street could get such a job, but usually a bunch of low seniority longshoremen would gather. And if the gang carrier recognized you, okay, you've got a job for the evening. Um, but right, that hiring center is basically a response to employer favoritism
Yeah.
in the various industries we're talking about.
Well, when you talk about having to go down at night to find work, it's like your job controls your life. You had nothing to do but look for work, and there was not a regular schedule. Did you have a family at that
In
time?
some sense, yeah,
Were you
I did not have family.
okay?
I
So
was
you were
single.
as a single person,
Flexibility,
you
but
huh?
yes, and I could spare a Saturday night to do very nasty work unloading copper from Pakistan on a
Yeah,
very hot August night in about 1977. Nasty work.
yeah.
Another job would have been lashing down trucks headed to and from Puerto Rico
Uh,
on a ship at the foot of Canton, crawling underneath trailer trucks in the pitch dark. Because the ship bounces around in the ocean. You can't just drive a truck onto the ship and park it. use cables to lash it down. Likewise with containers today.
So this was a
One of the things
challenge
that's
for,
overlooked with the long distance folk.
I'm sorry. So this work schedule would be a challenge for people with families who are
Oh,
trying to keep,
definitely so. Yeah.
uh,
Yes, that's right.
and there was also the
Some,
opportunity in a lot of areas for favoritism, both from the union and from the employers, from the
that's right.
companies.
That's
And
right.
so how did your campaign go? What were highlights of it?
Well, I'm not remembering details, but most of my dialogue was with the low seniority people with whom I worked. Again, my network at work would be again much more flexible than in a factory because it included the people in my seniority category who I'd share a line with in the morning and members of the various gangs in which I was assigned. So in a given week, I'd have 20 coworkers in the line and maybe 50 others in the several gangs in which I had worked for one day apiece.
Okay.
Very informal campaign. I didn't give any speeches to anybody. Um, People kind of knew that I was active as a talking delegate contributor around safety, around the issues we're talking about, favoritism.
It must have been an
But
exciting time.
again, it was an exciting time, yes. But again, the tradition was a very conservative, only pay attention to people you know
Yeah.
and have known for a long time. So I doubt that I got very many votes from the high seniority white guys.
Okay.
The mafia, as in on the waterfront, did not exist in Baltimore, but plenty of conservative old white Polish guys
Hmm.
um, who saw it was just a job
Yeah. Okay.
and didn't really participate in union stuff.
Well, how long did you stay working on the docks? You said you started in 74.
I started in June 74 and left in June 82 in order to
Okay.
go back to school to become a union guy. I
To
got
become,
gradually increased interest in safety issues and decided
okay.
I could be useful to the labor movement as a safety guy, as opposed to being an activist around democracy and paying the rent by unloading ships. I could get a, and I did,
And whom did you work for then
meaning
as a safety guy?
I went to Hopkins School of Hygiene on Wolf Street, had a program funded by NIOSH to train people in factory inspection and safety work. And I was able to get a job with a small union of chemical workers called the International Chemical Workers Union in Akron, Ohio, where I started in January of 1984.
So you
So
moved
between
then from,
84 and
you left Baltimore then
Baltimore
in 84. Okay.
to Akron, right? And spent 20 years as a worker health and safety professional after
Oh,
leaving the
very good.
docks.
Okay. In your memoir, which you put together, you mentioned a very good guy, Jim Kehoe. You want to talk a little bit about his program?
Jim Keogh was a physician at that hospital on the eastern end of Eastern Avenue. I've forgotten the name of the hospital. It might be called City Hospital. Anyway, Jim Keogh was a very progressive physician who sadly passed away some 20 or 30 years ago. But to give you an example, carbon monoxide was sometimes a problem in the lower hold of a ship from poorly maintained forklifts. Again, in this transition from manual unloading to machine unloading, we often put a forklift in the hold of a ship, and the smoke from the forklift uh, often caused dizziness among longshoremen. One of my earliest health and safety things was to try to respond to that dizziness from the smoke in the lower hold. I called Jim Keogh from work and asked what I should do about the carbon monoxide. He offered to send a medical resident over to the docks to draw blood from the workers who had symptoms. I turned him down because I think the workers finished by that point, and it couldn't be done. But Jim Keogh was very much an ally of the workers' movements for improved
Hmm.
safety and health during that period we're talking about.
All right.
Later on, I met several other such out at Johns Hopkins.
Any other particular memories about living or working in Baltimore?
Well, yes. Am I still there?
Yeah,
My Zoom thing just as
we've got about
um,
7 minutes to go.
anyway. Okay. I learned a lot from some of the other groups that were trying to reform the Steelworkers Union, the Machinists Union, etc. Um, so informally, I was part of a network of groups that were doing similar work to what we were doing on the docks. Um, I was living not very far from drawing a blank on the street. Anyway, I was in the 900 block of Patterson Park Avenue. Not very far away was a Sarco steel mill that manufactured stainless steel. And there was an active steelworkers local there that, again, was trying to, Ed Sadlowski was running for president of the Steelworkers Union. At the time, the upper hierarchy of that union was very, didn't encourage member participation.
Huh.
Um,
But if you're on living
so I
in
learned a lot
Patterson
from him.
Park, you're living in Patterson Park, you must have gone to Matthew's Pizza, right? You're gonna get some brick.
I don't recall.
No?
But,
It's a famous pizza on Eastern Avenue. Okay. Um, any other memories of Baltimore? Anything else you did while you were here?
well, as part of that crew of union safety people, um, I was among the founders of Maryland Committee on Occupational Safety and Health. Maryland COSH
Okay.
was created by perhaps six of us, three or four workers, three or four public health activists from Johns Hopkins got together to create this group to improve worker education and advocacy around workplace safety. There's still a network of COSH groups around the country, although Maryland COSH no longer exists.
Hmm.
So we did some useful work uh, publicizing worker safety and health, which was Jimmy Carter was president at that time, and the Department of Labor and OSHA supported worker education. So Maryland COSH was part of a network of COSH groups with some assistance from the Carter administration to improve worker education.
You remember any other people who were involved in Maryland Kosh?
Um, yes, Janie Gordon was one of the other leaders. At the time, she was an employee of the International Union of Electrical, IUE. There are three different electrical unions, so I sometimes scramble the names.
Right.
IUE was a national union, industrial union of electrical workers, and Janie commuted from Baltimore to Washington as a safety person. Um, Jane Halpern would have been a physician policy person at Hopkins School of Hygiene, very interested in prevention of disease.
Okay.
So we had and Dave Wilson was the president of the Steelworkers
Right.
2609, and he would have been one of the active union people. We used his hall occasionally for Maryland Kosh events.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for these memories. And we will post this video and see if we have questions that people want to ask you, and we'll have you back. Any other last minute
Yeah, and I'll be
memories?
glad to elaborate. It's
Huh?
it continues.
What?
Thanks.
Yeah, hold on.